Senator Gianaris.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the sponsor yield for question?
Will you yield, Senator Lanza?
Mr. President.
I've heard the answers to my colleagues' questions, and I'm just trying to get at the heart of assuming a worst-case scenario, because I understand what the bill is trying to do. But assuming that a terrorism trial, is coming to New York anyway at the federal level, if this were enacted into law, what would this allow the NYPD and others to do to protect our citizens while that trial was taking place?
Through you, Mr. President, let's just analyze the options here if this legislation becomes law. First, I believe that it would prevent those trials from coming to Manhattan. And that is the intent of this legislation. I've been clear about that and honest about that. But assuming President Obama or Attorney General Holder say to heck with the will of the people in New York, to heck with the fact that they're not going to provide resources by way of taxpayer dollars, $1 billion, we're still going to do it. We're going to shove it down their throats. We're going to have those trials there. Well, then I would imagine what would happen is that the federal government, not the taxpayers of New York City, not the taxpayers of New York State, the federal government would then be required to foot the bill.
That's what he imagines would happen, that's what he would like to happen, but let's project forward into the future. Let's project beyond this administration. Let's assume the country elects some right-wing lunatic for president who's a fiscal conservative and doesn't want to spend a dime protecting these trials because it's a local responsibility. These are things out of our control, what the federal government will do. Passing this bill or not is in our control as to what the state or our localities will or will be allowed to do. So again, assuming the worst-case scenario, which is the federal trial comes anyway, and the federal government decides not to expend any resources because it is a local responsibility, what does this legislation do, or what would it allow our local law enforcement to do to protect our citizens?
Yeah. Through you, Mr. President. So I suppose the only way this scenario plays itself out in your hypothetical is if some left-wing lunatic person lives in the White House, or well, I'm telling you how it would happen. It would only happen by virtue of a left-wing lunatic in the White House shoving this down the throats of the people of New York. It would only happen if a left-wing lunatic Attorney General of the United States would shove it down the throats of the people of the state of New York and would decide that they didn't care about your concerns about the costs, and not only would they shove it down the throats of the people of New York and say, hey, we believe we should aid and abet, provide comfort and convenience for terrorists who want to destroy us. Once they've made that decision, what you're saying is then they would do that and say that they weren't going to foot the bill. I have more faith, even in left-wing lunatic presidents, that if they were to make that decision, they would pay the bill.
Sponsor would continue to yield?
Yes.
Mr. President.
Senator.
Not for anything, but we had a right-wing shot, we had a left-wing shot. Can we keep the shots down and just keep the debate on a more elevated tone? Thank you.
I'll be happy to do so, Mr. President. I just want to point out the debate up until now has been very focused on partisan attack on our federal administration. But be that as it may, moving aside from that, the issue is whether you have a lunatic of any side in there. We don't control what's going to come out of the federal government. And so there is the possibility that there's a contingency that the federal government chooses to have a trial here and yet decides not to provide the resources or not adequately provide the resources. Let's say they'll provide some safety, but not to the degree we think it's necessary. This bill would prohibit our local law enforcement from doing what is necessary to protect its citizens. Is that not true?
No, that is not true, Mr. President. Not at all.
Well, please explain how it's not true.
You know, I listened to Senator Squadron talk about the fact that this bill would prevent the police department from protecting the citizens of the state of New York. That's not true. That's absolutely not true. The police department of the city of New York protects the people of the city every single day, and they do it, I think, better than anyone, anywhere in the country, if not the world. He said that somehow this would force the trial to go to a place that didn't have the expertise to do it. Somehow the federal court in New York is the only place where the expertise exists to do that. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. What you're saying is a military tribunal does not have the experience, does not have the competence, does not have the ability to do justice. If you feel that strongly about that, then why is it that you don't cry out to ensure that the American men and women who serve our nation in the armed forces, why do you not cry out and say they should have a civil trial? If you think they don't have the expertise and they can't get it done and they can't do justice, where is the shock, where is the outrage when every single day soldiers who protect our freedoms are tried at military tribunals? You're wrong. They have the expertise. And you're wrong. We would be safe. We would be safe because by virtue of this legislation, there would be no civil trial for enemy combatants in New York City.
Sponsor would continue to yield.
You continue to yield, Senator.
Yes, Mr. President.
With due respect, that last answer had nothing to do with my question, which is, what does this bill prohibit our local law enforcement from doing if, in fact, the trial is held in New York, and if, in fact, the federal government decides to provide less than adequate protection for that trial?
Mr. President, it doesn't speak to that. It says that the taxpayers of the City of New York, the State of New York, would not have to spend $1 billion providing rights to enemy combatants, which I believe they do not deserve. And so you can draw whatever conclusion you want, but the point of this is clear. I'm not ducking behind a piece of legislation to say that I'm trying to do something that I'm not. I am saying very clearly what it is I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make sure that those who want to destroy us are not provided more rights than the people who are trying to protect us. And with respect to the fact that no harm will come from these trials, look at the history. You're wrong. Senator Squadron said that this was local and this was an issue that affects his district. It affects all of us. I had many personal friends, people whom I loved, grew up with, and knew, who were killed that day. And in part, and I never try to take blame away from where it belongs, the blame is with those people who want to destroy us. But they were helped. They were helped out in their mission to carry out those murders and that attack because of the fact that a prior colleague of theirs was afforded a civil trial. And during that civil trial, for those of you who aren't attorneys, in the civil trial, there is civil discovery. And through civil discovery, they were able to go to school to learn about our weaknesses so that they can come back stronger, and they did. And more people died because of it. And so to say that somehow having a civil trial is something that should happen, or saying that somehow people won't be protected by virtue of doing it, is wrong. People in this country were exposed because of the fact that a civil trial was afforded to an enemy combatant.
Sponsor will continue to yield.
Yes.
I'm going to try one more time here. And
Sure.
the sponsor was very good at explaining why he put this bill in. He's very good at continuing to debate Senator Squadron's points or others' points, but I would ask if I can get an answer to my question, and I'll try to ask it a different way. If a federal trial is held on terrorism in New York under this legislation, would we be able to have a single member of the NYPD protecting us during that trial?
Yeah. So let me answer it this way. So if you go to the car dealership and you want to buy a new car, and they tell you the car costs $40,000, and you say you don't have the money, you don't get the car. The idea here is if we don't pay for it, we're not going to get it. So your concerns should be addressed that way. We're not going to get the trial if we pass this legislation. And if we do get the trial, because the president decides that he doesn't care, he's going to do it anyway, then the federal government would pay for it.
And I'll ask one final question as I try to get this answer from the sponsor, if he would continue to yield.
Mr. President, I'm asking the questions very directly, and I'll continue to answer questions as long as you have questions.
Okay, I appreciate that, Senator Lanza. I'm going to ask this as a yes or no question. If there's a federal trial in New York, and the mayor of New York City and the police commissioner determine that the federal protection that is being provided to New Yorkers during that trial is inadequate, would this bill permit them to lend a single member of the NYPD to the protection to make sure that its citizens are protected beyond what the federal government is doing? Yes or no?
Yeah. So, through you, Mr. President, Senator Gianaris, you can ask the questions the way you want. I'm going to answer them the way I want. And the answer to the question is that if the federal government decided to ignore the reality of this law, if it becomes law, and I hope it does, if they decide to ignore the will of the people, then they would pay for they'd foot the bill, not the taxpayers. But again, I'm being very clear. I do not believe, in fact, I know, that if there's no money to support a trial, there will be no trial.
And if I could ask one follow-up, if the
Yes, Mr.
Senator
President.
continue to yield. What if the federal government agrees, under your scenario, to provide the protection and to pay for the protection, but we don't think they're doing enough? Would this bill not prohibit the City of New York from providing additional protection beyond what the federal government is doing?
Mr. President, I mean, we can play the hypothetical game all day long with what the federal government will do, what they won't do. They're going to pay for half of it. They're going to pay for all of it. They'll continue to decide that they want to have a civil trial. And we could do this all. This is really simple. It really is. If you agree with me that enemy combatants of the United States of America who are determined to destroy this nation do not deserve to have a civil trial, then you should support this legislation, because it says that we will not support a civil trial financially in New York State. That's all it does. And by not supporting something financially, typically you end up not having it. And that clearly is the legislative intent with this legislation. If someone has a better idea, because we're talking about the what-ifs and the hypotheticals, and I'd really like to talk about if the objection is the belief that there should be a civil trial, which I know some people truly believe, like the President, like the Attorney General, like some people here, and I can respect that opinion. I disagree with it. We should talk about that instead of going around the way here and act as though the problem with this bill from your point of view is that somehow the people of the City of New York are not going to be protected by the police department of the City of New York. Let's not play that game. That's disingenuous. The people of the City of New York have always been protected by the police officers in New York City. They will always be protected by the police officers in New York City. They are the greatest police department on earth. That will not change by virtue of this legislation. Everyone knows that. Everyone sees that. So let's talk about what this is really about, a difference of opinion with respect to whether or not enemy combatants should be afforded civil trials. I believe they should not.
Thank you, Senator Lanz. For instance, on the bill, Mr. President. The sponsor is correct. This bill is simple. The problem is the bill is also very dangerous. I want to, since he's so intent on talking about the bigger issue that this bill doesn't actually address directly, I'll be happy to answer his question for him. I do not support civil trials for enemy combatants. We are in agreement on that issue. The difference lies in a bill that is trying to get at something that we don't have any jurisdiction over and does so in a way that puts New Yorkers at risk. A vote in favor of this bill is a vote to put people of New York at risk of danger, of terrorist attacks, of local law enforcement not providing the protection that they would like to, because we would strip them of the ability to fund those efforts. If the sponsor and those who support this bill are interested in dealing with this issue appropriately, they should write a letter to their federal authorities. They should run for Congress if they want to run for Congress and deal with this where the decision's actually made. But the fact is, whether or not federal civil trials are held in New York is not a decision for New York State government. It is a decision for the federal government to make, and they're going to make it no matter what we say here. The only thing this is doing is putting a gun to our own heads and saying, do what we want or I'm going to shoot. That is not an intelligent way to govern, my colleagues. We run a dangerous risk of exposing people to terrorism exactly when what we're trying to do is prevent additional acts by preventing civil trials, which I agree with you on. This bill is clearly not the way to do it. Denying law enforcement the ability to do their job at a most sensitive time and during a most sensitive trial is insane. I will be voting no. I encourage my colleagues to join me.